In our previous tutorial, we looked at running an embedded Tomcat server in IntelliJ to connect to the MariaDB charity database. Here we define the Spring application context in an application context.xml definition file, and we defined a context listener class in web.xml that reads the DataSource bean that we defined in the application context.xml. In this tutorial, we will create a standard Java application or jar that will launch an embedded Tomcat web server and set up and connect to MariaDB through a Spring configuration class wherein we define the data source with the help of Spring annotations. In other words, instead of using XML definition files, we will now use Java classes and Spring annotations. For my YouTube students, this slideshow is part of a YouTube playlist. The playlist URL will be listed in the description and comments of this lesson. All source code for this playlist will be available for free in a GitHub repository. These are the high-level steps we will perform in this lesson. First, we will create a new JDB6 Maven module inside of IntelliJ. Then we will update the Maven POM file with the required Maven plugins and the dependencies for Tomcat and Spring. In number 3, we will define a data source in a Spring configuration class. And step 4, we will create an application main method to launch Tomcat 8. Step number 5, we will read in the data source from the Spring configuration class in our main method. Inside the main method, in step number 6, we will access the data source bean through the Servlet code. And now looking at our Markdown documentation for our current JDB6 embedded Tomcat Spring config class, we will follow along in IntelliJ. So first it says create a new Java Maven module. So let's switch over to IntelliJ. Looking at our current Git branch, we are in our starting branch of the JDB6 tutorial. So now we'll create the new module, file, new module, and Maven module. Next, our name. The artifact coordinates look good, and select finish. Here is our new JDB6 module that IntelliJ just created for us. So we'll create a new package. And back to the Markdown documentation. Now we will update the generated pom.xml files, which in our case will be the JDB6 and the parent pom. Update the package to be a jar. We'll add the Tomcat dependencies. We'll add the Spring framework dependencies. We will also be adding Log4j and Java standard tag library dependencies. We'll also add a Maven build plugin that allows us to package and run a Tomcat web application from the command line. And finally, we will update the parent POM. Let's start with the dependency version numbers here. And then we'll bring over the dependencies. So all the Spring dependencies and all the Tomcat dependencies from our previous tutorial. And then we also add Log4j and the Java standard tag library. And of course the all important MariaDB Java client. And now we will bring over our build section and build plugins. That is the build section in its entirety. So we have the App Assembler Maven plugin, in which we specify the Nicor Designs main class and its name and what to do when we execute the plugin. And then we have the Maven execution plugin. And once again, we specify the main class. and we set one system property in this plugin. And let's go and look at our parent POM. This looks good. Now back to our Markdown documentation. Step number 4, we will create the application with a main method that does all the setup and configuration. Now the template for this application is a basic Spring MVC application. We will use Spring annotations and the Spring configuration classes. This module will use Spring application configuration Java classes to define the DataSource bean. It will use a Spring web configuration class to define the MVC view resolver bean. And then we will run the embedded Tomcat from a Spring component. We will use a database hello service Spring component to present the hello world screen and the MariaDB catalog name. The welcome controller is where all the logic will be tied together. Back to IntelliJ now. Going back to our previous tutorial, we see that if we want to use an embedded Tomcat, we need to have a web application directory. So let's bring that over underneath our main directory. And we see our welcome JSP and index.jsp. Under our resources directory, we will bring over some legacy XML configuration file. And as we can see, this is the log4j console appender and the logging levels for the Spring framework and our application. Now we can go back to our base package and we'll bring over all the code. So let's start with the configuration classes. We have an application config class that will contain the DataSource bean, and we have a web config class that essentially sets up our Spring MVC with a view resolver, and the location of our view is the welcome.jsp. And we can see that it expects the controller package here, so we'll bring that in next. It also expects the service package. So let's first bring in the service package. And we have our hello service. We have the implementation, and it essentially just returns the message. And here it's going to use the database util to get the catalog name. And here is our database util, which if you followed along with all the previous tutorials, you'll be quite familiar right now. And going back, we see we're still missing the controller package. So let's copy that over. And here is our welcome controller. You see we have the hello/hello/hello mapping. It says the model attribute of the hello service, and it returns the welcome page with the updated model, of course. And now, of course, everything is run by an embedded Tomcat server. So we'll bring over all our server-related code. And once again, if you followed along in the previous tutorials, you'll notice that this is essentially a major refactoring of the code that we had in our main methods to be able to set up and launch an embedded Tomcat server. We've got the web resources set. We've got the web resource root set up. We've got the update. We see that we are still missing the main class that we need to bring in. We've got the get web content folder, temp path, web port, the main root folder, and then here is what we have previously coded in a main method, where we actually set up the embedded Tomcat with the correct port number, folder in which it's running, the web content folder to serve content, and then setting up the standard context, updating the web resource root, and starting it. And we can see this is now an embedded Spring component. So let's bring over that main method. And here is our main method. And it looks a lot simpler now because we set up our system properties for our embedded Tomcat. We create the Spring Annotation config application context, and we register our server configuration class with the context, which essentially will scan the base package of server, and it refreshes the context and starts the context. And at this stage, it looks like we have everything to run and test our code. So let's run our Maven clean install. That looks good. Now looking at our POM directory, we have set up the execution Maven plugin. So let's try and use that to launch our main method, which in turn will launch the embedded Tomcat application with the Spring MVC application. So we'll go to the terminal window and change to the Spring JDBC 6 directory. First we'll run Maven clean install here, and then to get our instructions, we'll go back to our Markdown document. We've already demonstrated running main in IntelliJ, so let's try and use the Maven execute plugin, Maven execute Java. And it looks like the Maven execute plugin has launched our Tomcat. And back to our Markdown documentation. Let's see what the code results are. And excellent. This is a Spring MVC application running an embedded Tomcat from a class, and config class, and it uses the database utility to get the catalog name of the MariaDB database. And this concludes this lesson. I will see you in the next tutorial.